Imagine a man so powerful. He was called the Pope, not a man of God, but a man of blood and absolute power. A man who, from the tranquil, sun-drenched silence of a rustic Sicilian estate, commanded a shadow army and sanctioned over 80 murders with a mere nod, including the brutal, earth-shattering killings of the very judges who dared to stand against his empire. This is not a fictional thriller. This is the real, chilling, and meticulously documented story of Michele Greco, the supreme boss of Cosa Nostra, a man whose life was a tapestry woven with threads of absolute power, immense wealth, and staggering violence. If you are ready to delve into the darkest corridors of organized crime, to understand how a man becomes a living legend of terror, to walk through the rise and fall of a kingpin who believed he was untouchable, then listen closely. This is a story you will not forget. For deep dives into the true stories of the world's most formidable figures, remember to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the heart of darkness. The island of Sicily, bathed in the Mediterranean sun, with its ancient olive groves and rugged landscapes, holds secrets deeper than its volcanic roots. It is a land of stark contrasts, where breathtaking beauty coexists with a deep-seated, centuries-old culture of silence and power known as Omert. It was into this world, on May 12, 1924, in the Palermo neighborhood of Sicily, that Michele Greco was born. His was not a beginning from nothing. It was an inheritance. The Greco family, known as the family of Sicily, was already a formidable force within the burgeoning Sicilian Mafia, the Cosa Nostra. Their power base was not in the gritty urban underworld of popular imagination, but curiously, in the agricultural heartland. They controlled the lucrative citrus fruit trade, the water supply, and the very land itself. From his earliest days, Michele was not just a boy. He was a prince in this hidden kingdom, learning the unwritten rules of power, loyalty, and ruthlessness at his father's knee. He grew up understanding that their wealth, their respect, their very way of life was built upon a foundation of controlled terror and intricate networks of influence that reached into the police stations, the courtrooms, and the political halls of Palermo. The young Michele was a quiet, observant child, but beneath that calm exterior, the lessons of his environment were taking root. He learned that a man's word, once given in the right context, was his bond, but that betrayal, or even perceived weakness, was a sin punishable by death. He saw how disputes over a lemon grove could be settled not with lawyers, but with a single, unambiguous act of violence that would send a message echoing through the entire region. This was his normal. The world outside might see farmers and landowners. He saw the generals and soldiers of a silent war. The estate in Sicily, with its sprawling gardens and fortified walls, was not just his home. It was the first fortress of his future empire, the nursery where a future Pope was being groomed, completely unaware of the world beyond the family's control, a world that would one day dare to challenge his absolute authority. His rise was not an accident. It was a destiny being meticulously prepared, one silent lesson at a time. in the shadow of the orange and lemon trees that perfumed the air with a sweetness that often belied the iron and blood scent of the power they represented. The ascent of Michele Greco within the intricate, shadowy hierarchy of Cosa Nostra was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, deliberate burn. A gradual accumulation of power and respect that mirrored the patient growth of the citrus trees in his family's orchards. The post-war period in Sicily was a time of tumultuous change and immense opportunity for men of his ilk. As Italy rebuilt itself, the mafia evolved, shifting from its rural, land-based power structure to a more sophisticated, urban, and terrifyingly profitable criminal enterprise. The old guards, the mustachioed patriarchs of the countryside, were slowly being eclipsed by a new, more ruthless generation, and Michele Greco, with his quiet intelligence and deep-rooted connections, positioned himself perfectly at this crossroads. He was not a flamboyant, publicly feared gangster. His strength lay in his perceived legitimacy. To the outside world, he was ingegner, the engineer, a successful businessman and a gentleman farmer, a pillar of the agricultural community. He hosted lavish parties at his sprawling estate, known as the Piano della Scala, a property that would soon become as infamous as the man himself. This estate was not merely a home, it was a strategic command center, a sanctuary, and a symbol of his burgeoning power. Its high walls and secluded location made it the perfect place for the clandestine meetings of the cupola, the mafia's supreme ruling body. A commission formed to regulate the affairs of the various Palermo families to avoid costly internal wars. It was within these opulent rooms, surrounded by the trappings of legitimate wealth, that the most nefarious plans were laid. Greco's rise was catalyzed by a period of internal conflict known as the First Mafia War in the early 1960s, a brutal conflict sparked by a rift in the drug trade. While other prominent bosses were killed or arrested, Greco's low-profile, agrarian-based strategy allowed him to remain relatively unscathed, a spider at the center of a web, watching and waiting. His reputation for being calm, deliberate, and fiercely intelligent grew. He was seen as a mediator, a man of reason in a world of hot-headed violence, a man who could see the bigger picture. This perception, carefully cultivated and meticulously maintained, was his greatest asset. By the time the dust from the First War settled, and as the Italian state launched its first major anti-mafia efforts, the old order had been decimated. Into this power vacuum stepped Michele Greco. He didn't seize power with a loud proclamation. He simply assumed it, as if it were his birthright, which, in many ways, it was. The other families, weary of conflict and in need of a stable, respected leader who could oversee the organization's most lucrative new venture, the transnational heroin trade, turned to him. It was a consensus. He became the head of the cupola, the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. His estate, Piano della Scala, was now the Vatican of Cosa Nostra, and he, Michele Greco, was its pope. This title, Papa, was not given lightly. It spoke to his perceived infallibility, his absolute authority, and the almost religious reverence with which he was treated by his underlings. From his throne room in the countryside, He now held the power of life and death over thousands, his influence stretching from the dusty fields of Sicily to the burgeoning criminal underworlds of New York and Boston, all connected by the invisible, deadly threads of the harrowing pipeline that would soon flood the streets with poison and fill the coffers of Cosa Nostra with unimaginable wealth, setting the stage for a reign of terror so brazen it would eventually provoke a backlash of a force and fury the mafia had never before encountered. The 1970s and early 1980s marked the zenith of Michele Greco's power, a period often referred to as the Great Crime or the Matanza, the slaughter, where the streets of Palermo were literally painted with blood, and the Sicilian Mafia, under his stewardship, reached an apogee of wealth, influence, and sheer, unadulterated brutality that remains unprecedented. This era was bankrolled by what became known as the Pisa Connection, a vast, intricate network that saw Sicilian mafiosi refining raw Turkish morphine base into pure heroin in clandestine labs hidden across the island, and then distributing it through pizzerias and other front businesses in the United States, flooding American cities with a wave of addiction and generating billions of dollars in profit. This financial tsunami transformed Cosa Nostra from a powerful criminal organization into a shadow state with more liquid capital than many legitimate nations. Greco, as the chairman of this corporate empire of death, oversaw this golden age. His word was law, his approval necessary for any major criminal enterprise, and his disapproval a certain death sentence. The Piano della Scala estate became the boardroom for this deadly corporation. It was here, amidst the serene beauty of the countryside, that the bosses of the various families would gather, discussing business, resolving disputes, and, most chillingly, signing death warrants. The killings during this period were not just about eliminating rivals. They were a systematic, calculated campaign to annihilate any and all opposition to the mafia's hegemony. The targets were diverse and terrifyingly bold. They included rival drug traffickers who dared to operate outside the cupola's sanction, but more significantly, they expanded to include politicians, journalists, police officers, and anyone in the public sphere who dared to speak the name Cosa Nostra and threaten its impunity. The mafia was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was asserting its dominance in the most brutal way possible, demonstrating to the people of Sicily that it, and not the Italian state, was the true sovereign power. The murders were often spectacularly violent, designed to send a message of terror that would resonate far beyond the immediate victim. Car bombs, known as autobombi, became a favored instrument of terror, capable of tearing apart not just a target, but entire city blocks, instilling a collective paralysis in the populace. Under Greco's leadership, the mafia became more than just a criminal organization. It became a terrorist organization, waging a war on the very concept of civil society. The wealth generated was staggering. Palermo saw a bizarre construction boom, with ill-gotten gains being laundered through grotesque, unfinished concrete monstrosities that scarred the city's beautiful landscape, a physical manifestation of the mafia's corrupting influence. Yet, Through all this, Michele Greco maintained his face, aid of the respectable gentleman farmer. He was rarely seen in the city, never associated directly with the violence. He was a ghost, a spectral presence whose name was whispered with fear, but whose face was unknown to most. He issued his orders from his rural fortress, insulated by layers of command and a wall of silence so impenetrable it seemed he would never be touched. He lived a life of luxury and absolute power, convinced of his own invincibility, believing that the system of fear and corruption he had perfected would protect him forever. He could not foresee that this very reign of terror, this matanza, was simultaneously creating its own antibodies, forging a generation of magistrates and law enforcement officials whose resolve would be hardened by the very bloodshed intended to intimidate them into submission. The storm was gathering, and the first cracks in his empire would not come from a rival gangster, but from the quiet, determined men in the halls of justice, men who would look upon the carnage and refuse to look away. The turning point, the moment the pendulum began its slow, inexorable swing back towards justice, was not a single event, but a gathering storm of courageous defiance, and it crystallized around a new, formidable foe that Michele Greco and his cupola had underestimated. A small, dedicated group of anti-mafia magistrates in Palermo. These were not the bureaucrats of old. They were young, intellectually rigorous, and morally unshakable men, led by the formidable chief magistrate, Cesare Terranova, and later, the iconic duo of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. They understood that to fight a hydra, like organization such as Cosa Nostra, they needed a new strategy. They began to move beyond reacting to individual murders and started building a massive, collective body of evidence, treating the mafia not as a series of disconnected criminal acts, but as a single, unified criminal association, a structure that could be mapped, understood, and dismantled. This was a revolutionary approach. They started patiently, meticulously, connecting the dots between seemingly isolated killings, extortion rackets, and drug shipments, slowly piecing together the architecture of the monster. The key to their strategy was the pentiti, the repentant mafiosi, a concept previously unthinkable in a culture governed by Omert. The first major crack appeared with a man named Tommaso Buscetta, a high-ranking boss who turned state's witness following the brutal murders of his sons and brothers in an internal mafia war. Buscetta was not a minor player. He was a man of honor, a respected figure who understood the organization's deepest secrets. His decision to break the code of silence was catastrophic for Greco's empire. Buscetta provided Falcone with the Rosetta Stone to decipher Cosa Nostra's inner workings. He explained the hierarchy, the rituals, the chain of command, and, most critically, he named names. He identified Michele Greco as the head of the cupola, the Pope, the ultimate authority who sanctioned the most high-profile murders. But Buscetta was just the first. His cooperation gave other disillusioned mafiosi the courage to follow suit, men like Salvatore Contorno, who added further layers of detail and confirmation. This was the birth of the Maxi trial, an audacious, unprecedented legal proceeding that would put the entire leadership of Cosa Nostra in the dock. For the first time, the state was not chasing foot soldiers, it was aiming for the very head of the beast, and that head was Michele Greco. The mafia's response to this gathering threat was, predictably, a swift and brutal escalation of violence, a desperate attempt to decapitate the state's response before it could fully form. This period saw some of the most shocking and tragic assassinations in Italian history. They began with General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, the prefect of Palermo, a man who had defeated left-wing terrorism in Italy and was sent to Sicily to do the same to the mafia. He was gunned down with his wife in a Palermo street in 1982, a brazen message that no one, not even a symbol of the state itself, was beyond their reach. Then came the murders of the magistrates themselves. Chief Magistrate Cesare Terranova, a pioneer of the anti-mafia pool, was killed in 1979. But the killing that truly shook the nation's conscience and galvanized the will to fight back was the assassination of Pio La Torre, a communist politician who had drafted a pioneering law that made membership in a mafia type association a crime and allowed for the seizure of mafia assets. He was murdered in 1982. Each bullet was intended to kill not just a man, but an idea. Instead, it forged that idea into steel. The violence meant to terrorize instead created martyrs and hardened the resolve of Falcone, Borsellino, and their team. They worked in fortified offices under constant armed guard, knowing they were living on borrowed time, yet they pressed on, compiling thousands of pages of testimony and evidence that would form the basis for the largest mafia trial in history. Michele Greco, from his isolated estate, could feel the walls closing in. The old methods of intimidation were no longer working as they once had. The state, for the first time, was not backing down. A direct, final confrontation was now inevitable, and it would take place not in the dark alleys of Palermo, but under the bright lights of a specially constructed bunker-style courtroom, a fortress of law built to put the Pope of Cosa Nostra on trial for his life. The Maxi trial, formerly known as the Maxi Processo, was not merely a court case. It was a historic, monumental clash of two diametrically opposed worldviews. A theatrical epic staged on a scale never before seen in the annals of criminal justice. A direct and deliberate challenge to the very existence of Cosa Nostra, with Michele Greco as its prime defendant. The logistical challenges alone were staggering. To accommodate the unprecedented number of defendants, witnesses, and lawyers, the authorities constructed a massive, fortified courtroom bunker, known as the Ola Bunker, within the walls of the Ucciardone prison in Palermo, a symbolic and practical decision to hold the trial in the heart of the mafia's own territory. This fortress was designed to be impervious to attack, a clear message that the state would not be intimidated. When the trial opened on February 10, 1986, the world watched in awe. The scene was surreal for 75 defendants, a sea of humanity that included the entire upper echelon of the Sicilian Mafia, sat in rows of caged enclosures, a zoological display of the most dangerous predators society had produced. Among them, sitting with an air of detached, almost bored dignity, was Michele Greco. He was no longer the shadowy ghost of Sicily. He was now prisoner number 1627, charged with being the head of Cosa Nostra and directly responsible for over 80 murders, including the assassinations of General Dalla Chiesa and Piola Tor. The prosecution's case, masterminded by Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, was a colossal tapestry of evidence, a meticulous compilation of years of investigation, financial records, intercepted conversations, and, most devastatingly, the testimonies of the pentiti. Tommaso Buscetta took the stand, a calm, articulate, and devastating witness. He looked his former associates in the eye and detailed the inner workings of the cupola, identifying Greco as its unquestioned leader, the man who presided over the meetings at Piano della Scala, where murders were commissioned like business contracts. His testimony was corroborated and expanded upon by Salvatore Contorno and others, creating an irrefutable, interlocking narrative of criminal conspiracy. The defense strategy was one of blanket denial, contempt, and intimidation. The defendants and their lawyers, some of whom were later discovered to be on the mafia's payroll, mocked the proceedings, shouting insults, creating disruptions, and attempting to paint the pentiti as traitors and liars, men without honor seeking to save their own skins. They claimed Cosa Nostra did not exist. It was a fantasy invented by the state to persecute honest Sicilians. Michele Greco himself, when given the opportunity to speak, delivered a performance of wounded indignation. He portrayed himself as a simple, hard-working farmer, a family man, a victim of a vast and unjust conspiracy. He spoke of his love for his land, his citrus groves, his respectable life, expressing shock and horror at the monstrous crimes he was being accused of. "I am a gentleman, not a killer," he famously declared, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the bloody litany of murders being laid at his feet. But the evidence was overwhelming. The trial was a daily spectacle broadcast across the nation, and for the first time, the Italian public saw the true face of the mafia, not as romanticized bandits, but as cold-blooded, calculating CEOs of death. The presiding judge, Alfonso Giordano, maintained a firm, stoic control over the chaotic proceedings, ensuring that the wheels of justice, however slowly, kept turning. For 22 months, the Olla bunker was the epicenter of a national drama, a battle for the soul of Sicily. The outcome was far from certain. The mafia still wielded immense power, and the threat of violence hung over the trial like a pall. Yet, Falcone, Borsellino, and their team pressed on, driven by the memory of their murdered colleagues and an unwavering belief in the rule of law. They were not just prosecuting individuals. They were putting the entire concept of omerta and mafia impunity on trial, and the world was watching, waiting to see if a system built on fear could finally be defeated by a system built on fact, evidence, and the courageous, quiet persistence of a few good men. The gavel was about to fall, and its echo would be heard around the world. The verdict, when it finally came on December 16, 1987, sent seismic shockwaves through Italy and the criminal underworld across the globe, representing not just a legal judgment, but a profound moral and symbolic victory for the Italian state a definitive crack in the invincible armor of Cosa Nostra. After nearly 2 years of dramatic testimony, countless hours of deliberation, and sifting through a mountain of evidence that stood several meters high, the 3-judge panel, presided over by Judge Alfonso Giordano, delivered its historic decision. The courtroom, for once, was utterly silent. The usual cacophony of the defendants and their lawyers stifled by the weight of the moment. One by one, the names were called, and the sentences were read out, a relentless, rolling thunder of condemnation of the 475 defendants. 342 were found guilty and convicted on charges ranging from murder and drug trafficking to the previously unprosecutable crime of simple mafia association. The collective sentences amounted to over 600 years in prison, a number so staggering it seemed to belong to the realm of fiction. But all eyes were on the top of the pyramid, on the man who had embodied the absolute power of the organization. When Michele Greco's name was called, the conviction was for being the mastermind behind it all. He was found guilty of a breathtaking litany of crimes, including his role as the head of the cupola and his direct involvement in authorizing dozens of murders. The sentence was the most severe the Italian legal system could impose: ergastolo, life imprisonment, meaning he would die behind bars, a fate once considered unthinkable for a man of his stature. For the families of the victims, for the magistrates who had risked everything, for the ordinary citizens of Sicily who had lived in terror, it was a moment of catharsis and vindication. The state had not flinched. The myth of mafia invincibility had been shattered in a single, monumental ruling. The news was celebrated in the streets of Palermo, not with wild jubilation, but with a quiet, profound sense of relief, a feeling that a long, dark night might finally be giving way to dawn. Giovanni Falcone, who had masterminded the entire legal strategy, famously remarked, "The mafia is a human phenomenon, and like all human phenomena, it had a beginning and will also have an end." The Maxi trial seemed to be that beginning of the end. However, the story was far from over. The mafia, wounded and humiliated, was not going to accept this defeat passively. The convictions were immediately appealed, as was standard in the Italian legal system, launching a new, tense period of waiting. More ominously, the mafia's response to this unprecedented judicial assault was being planned in the shadows. The period following the verdict saw a chilling recalibration of their strategy. The era of mass, anonymous shootings was supplemented by a more targeted, symbolic, and devastating form of violence aimed at the very heart of the state's victory. The message was clear: you can imprison our men, but we are still here, and we can still reach you. The Maxi trial had been a battle of unprecedented scale, a day for justice, but the war was still raging. The mafia was preparing its counter-offensive, and it would be merciless, proving that while the state had won a crucial legal victory, the cost of that victory was yet to be fully paid, and the man they called the Pope, though behind bars, remained a potent symbol around which the remnants of his empire could rally and plot their bloody revenge. Setting the stage for some of the most tragic and defining moments in Italy's long struggle against organized crime, a grim reminder that decapitating a snake does not always mean its body will stop writhing. The mafia's vengeance for the Maxi trial was not a spontaneous outburst of rage, but a coldly calculated, strategic campaign of terror designed to annihilate the state's morale and reverse its greatest legal victory, a period that would come to be known as the Season of Slaughter, and cement the early 1990s as some of the darkest years in Italy's modern history. From their prison cells, bosses like Michele Greco, though physically confined, still wielded immense influence. Their orders relayed through wives, lawyers, and loyalists on the outside, directing a new generation of ruthless killers. The primary objective was clear: decapitate the anti-mafia movement by eliminating its most brilliant and symbolic leaders, thereby proving the state's power was an illusion and shattering the hope that the Maxi trial had inspired. The first cataclysmic blow fell on May 23, 1992, on a stretch of highway near Capaci, just outside Palermo. Giovanni Falcone, the architect of the Maxi trial, was returning to his native Sicily with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, also a magistrate. The mafia had planted over half a ton of high explosives in a drainage tunnel under the highway, and as Falcone's motorcade passed over it, a remote, controlled detonation created a crater so deep it was as if the earth itself had opened up to swallow hope. The explosion was heard for miles. Falcone, his wife, and 3 police officers in their escort were instantly killed. The attack was not just an assassination. It was an act of war, a declaration that the state could not protect its finest servants. The nation was plunged into a state of collective shock and mourning. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in silent, tearful vigils, holding signs that read simply, "Giovanni, you are with us." The mafia had intended to terrorize, but Falcone's murder had the opposite effect, galvanizing public outrage to a fever pitch. Yet, the killing machine was not satiated. Just under 2 months later, on July 19, 1992, the second devastating strike occurred. Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's closest friend and colleague, a man who had taken up the mantle of the fight with unwavering resolve, was visiting his mother in Palermo. As he arrived at her apartment building, a car packed with explosives was detonated by a triggerman, obliterating the quiet residential street. Borsellino and the 5 police officers guarding him were torn to pieces. The twin massacres, just 57 days apart, felt like an apocalypse. The Italian state was reeling, humiliated and enraged. It was now undeniable that the mafia had infiltrated the state's security apparatus at the highest levels. The timing and precision of the attacks suggested inside information. The public's grief quickly turned to fury directed at a political class perceived as corrupt, complicit, and incompetent. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino marked a fundamental turning point. They were no longer seen as just the deaths of 2 magistrates, but as martyrdoms that exposed a deep sickness within the Italian Republic itself. In response, the government was forced to take draconian measures it had long resisted. The military was sent to Sicily. The anti-mafia laws that Falcone and Borsellino had championed were strengthened further and the use of pentiti was intensified, creating a flood of new collaborators desperate to seek redemption or revenge in the wake of the shocking killings. For Michele Greco, watching from his cell, these events were a double-edged sword. They demonstrated the enduring power of the organization he once led, a brutal validation of its methods. Yet, they also sealed his fate and that of his associates forever. The public and political will that had been momentarily galvanized by the Maxi trial was now forged into an unbreakable steel, resolved by the blood of its two greatest heroes. The Italian state, finally and fully awakened, was now committed to a total war, a war that would not end until every last member of the cupola, including the man they called the Pope, was buried, either in a prison cell or in the ground. The bomb blasts at Capaci and Via d'Amelio were the Mafia's last, desperate roar of supremacy, a roar that would ultimately summon a whirlwind of retribution from which it could never recover. In the grim, suffocating aftermath of the Falcone and Borsellino massacres, the Italian state, shamed and galvanized into unprecedented action, launched a comprehensive counter-offensive that would forever alter the balance of power between the law and Cosa Nostra, a relentless, multi-pronged assault that targeted the Mafia's leadership, its financial infrastructure, and its very social legitimacy with a ferocity it had never before encountered. The first and most immediate change was a military one. For the first time since the Second World War, the Italian government deployed over 7,000 soldiers to Sicily, not to fight a foreign enemy, but to patrol the streets of Palermo, guard public buildings, and symbolically reclaim the island from the shadow government that had ruled it for decades. This was a powerful psychological blow, a visible, armed manifestation of the state's presence, intended to break the Mafia's stranglehold on daily life and reassure a terrified populace. But the true war was being waged in the courtrooms and police headquarters. The floodgates of collaboration burst open. The sheer, wanton brutality of killing Falcone and Borsellino, beloved figures even among some who feared the Mafia, had sickened many within the organization's lower and middle ranks. A new, larger wave of pentiti emerged. Men like Giovanni Brusca, the triggerman for the Capaci bombing, and Salvatore Cancimi, who provided intimate details of the decision-making process within the cupola following the Maxi trial. These were not just disgruntled foot soldiers. They were hardened killers whose consciences, or perhaps whose sense of self-preservation, had been awakened by the organization's catastrophic overreach. Their testimonies were devastating, providing a minute-by-minute account of the planning of the two great massacres, and implicating not only the new generation of bosses, but also solidifying the culpability of the old guard, including Michele Greco, even from his prison cell. The legal system itself was reformed at a breakneck pace. The laws that Falcone and Borsellino had fought for were now implemented with full force, particularly the harsh Article 41 bis, which established a regime of strict, solitary confinement for convicted mafia bosses, severing their ability to communicate with the outside world and effectively ending their capacity to lead the organization from behind bars. this was a crucial blow, designed to break the spirit of men like Greco by isolating them completely from the world they once commanded. Simultaneously, the financial war intensified. Special police units, armed with new anti-racket legislation, began systematically seizing and confiscating mafia assets on an industrial scale. The vast estates, the apartment blocks, the bank accounts, the businesses, all the ill-gotten gains of decades of criminal enterprise were taken by the state and repurposed for social use. The symbolic pinnacle of this effort was the seizure of Michele Greco's own command center, the Piano della Scala estate. The sprawling property, the very heart of his power, where dozens of murders had been sanctioned, was confiscated and transformed, a profound and poetic act of justice. The state was no longer just imprisoning mafiosi, it was dismantling their empire brick by brick, euro by euro, stripping them of the wealth and property that constituted their identity and power base. This multi-faceted assault, military, judicial, and financial, created a perfect storm from which Cosa Nostra could not escape. The organization, which had always adapted and evolved, found itself for the first time facing an enemy that was more relentless, more sophisticated, and more unified than itself. The public sentiment had irrevocably turned. The wall of Omert, while not completely gone, had developed massive, irreparable cracks. The myth of the honorable mafioso, the man of respect, was dead, buried under the rubble of the Capassi Highway and the Via d'Amelio. In this new, hostile environment, the fate of Michele Greco, the aging pope in his isolated cell, was being sealed. His final appeals against his life sentence were moving through a judicial system that was now, finally, immune to intimidation and corruption, a system determined to see the sentences of the maxi trial made permanent, to ensure that the sacrifices of its martyred heroes had not been in vain. The long, patient, and bloody work of the magistrates was culminating in a final, unbreakable judgment, the final, unyielding confirmation of Michele Greco's guilt, and the definitive sealing of his fate, unfolded not in a single dramatic moment, but through the slow, grinding, and meticulous processes of the Italian appellate courts, a legal marathon that stretched through the early 1990s, where the monumental work of the maxi trial was subjected to intense scrutiny and ultimately resounding validation. The initial convictions, as monumental as they were, represented only the first round in a protracted legal battle. The defense lawyers, funded by the mafia's dwindling resources, launched a barrage of appeals, challenging the credibility of the pentiti, questioning procedural technicalities, and hoping that the passage of time and the chilling effect of the Falcone and Borsellino murders would soften the judiciary's resolve. They were mistaken. The higher courts, particularly the Supreme Court of Cassation, Italy's court of last resort, now operated under a transformed national consciousness. The magistrates reviewing the cases were acutely aware that they were not just evaluating legal statutes. They were safeguarding the legacy of their murdered colleagues and the very credibility of the Italian state. The evidence, so painstakingly assembled by Falcone and his team, proved to be legally robust and resilient. the testimonies of Tommaso Buscetta, Salvatore Contorno, and the new wave of collaborators formed an interlocking and corroborated narrative that the appeals courts found to be credible, consistent, and overwhelming. The central pillar of the prosecution's case, the existence of a unified, hierarchical Cosa Nostra led by a ruling cupola with Michele Greco at its apex, was upheld again and again. The Supreme Court's final ruling on the Maxi trial appeals in 1992, a year already stained by tragedy, was a landmark event. It confirmed the vast majority of the convictions, including the life sentences for the top bosses. For Michele Greco, this was the end of the judicial line. His life sentence was now immutable, a permanent legal reality. There would be no parole, no pardon, no escape. The man who had once commanded life and death from his rustic throne was now a number in the prison system, his world reduced to the cold dimensions of a cell under the harsh 41 bis regime. This regime was a form of psychological annihilation for a man of his stature. He was kept in isolation for 22 hours a day. His interactions with other inmates and the outside world severely monitored and restricted. He was permitted only brief, supervised visits from family members. His correspondence was censored, and he was denied access to any media that could allow him to maintain influence or even a clear understanding of the world beyond the prison walls. The intention was explicit to break the boss, to sever the symbolic head from the body of the organization completely and irrevocably. For Greco, this isolation was a fate perhaps worse than death. He was a creature of power, of consultation, of command. He thrived on respect, on networks, on the quiet hum of authority. Now, there was only silence, concrete, and the relentless ticking of time. He became a ghost in the state's machine, his name slowly fading from public discourse as new, more immediate crises captured the national attention. The Mafia, while not destroyed, was severely wounded and forced into a more defensive, less brazen posture, focusing on its lucrative business interests while avoiding the spectacular terrorist attacks that had provoked the state's full fury. The war was not over, but a decisive battle had been won. Michele Greco, the Pope of Cosa Nostra, was now a relic, a living monument to a bygone era of absolute power, now serving as a permanent testament to its ultimate fragility in the face of a determined and righteous civil society. His life sentence was the final, formal closing of a chapter, the official stamp on the historical record that declared the reign of the cupola, as he had known it, to be terminally over, its leader dethroned not by a rival, but by the very law he had spent a lifetime evading and mocking, a law that had finally, at great cost, found its strength and its voice in the silent, empty corridors of a maximum security prison, where the only kingdom left to rule was the few square meters of a cold, lonely cell. The final years of Michele Greco's life were a protracted, slow-motion epilogue to a saga of epic violence and power, a quiet and deliberate unraveling that stood in stark contrast to the thunderous drama of his reign and trial. Confined within the sterile, oppressive environment of a series of high security prisons, most notably the regime of Carcere Duro, hard prison, Under the 41 bis statute, his existence became a study in isolation and irrelevance. The world outside moved on, transforming in ways he could only dimly perceive through the heavily filtered channels permitted to him. Italy, in the new millennium, was a different country. The collective trauma of the early 1990s had given birth to a more resilient, though never fully healed, civil society. Anti-mafia associations, often led by the courageous children of victims, grew in strength and influence, ensuring that the memory of Falcone, Borsellino, and countless others remained active moral force in the national conscience. The mafia itself adapted, becoming less visibly violent and more deeply embedded in global finance and politics, a change that perhaps made it more insidious, but also rendered iconic. Old school bosses like Greco into figures of a past era, like dinosaurs in a world they no longer recognized. Inside his cell, Greco was reported to have maintained a facade of dignified stoicism, the last remaining vestige of his cultivated identity as a man of respect. He would read, follow limited news, and receive the rare, heavily supervised visit from family members. But the essence of his power, the ability to command, to influence, to make a single phone call that could alter destinies, was utterly extinguished. The state's strategy of severing his connections had worked with brutal efficiency. He was no longer "Oh papa." He was an elderly, ailing inmate suffering from the various ailments that inevitably accompany advanced age. His health began a steady decline, a physical manifestation of his faded power. He was transferred to a prison infirmary, his world shrinking even further from a cell to a sick room. It was a mundane, undramatic end for a man whose life had been defined by grand gestures of cruelty and control. There were no dramatic last stands, no deathbed confessions, no secret revelations whispered to a priest. His passing on February 13, 2008, at the age of 83 in the prison hospital of Opera in Milan, was noted by the press as the closing of a dark chapter. But it did not provoke the seismic shifts that the deaths of his enemies had. For many, it was a final, quiet form of justice. He died as he had lived his last decade and a half, incarcerated, isolated, and stripped of the authority that had defined his very being. His body was returned to Sicily, and he was buried in the family tomb in Sicily, the same neighborhood where his journey of power had begun 8 decades earlier. The funeral was a small, private affair, a stark contrast to the lavish, well-attended ceremonies of mafia bosses in the past. The era of public displays of respect for such figures was, for the most part, over. The story of Michele Greco does not end with his death, but rather with his legacy, a complex and troubling inheritance. On one hand, his life stands as the ultimate testament to the heights of power a mafioso could achieve, a case study in the consolidation of criminal authority and the terrifying effectiveness of systematic violence and corruption. He was, in many ways, the perfect embodiment of Cosa Nostra at the peak of its hubris and might. On the other hand, his conviction and imprisonment became an even more powerful symbol, proof that no one is truly untouchable. His fall, engineered by the courage of magistrates and the breaking of omerta, demonstrated that even the most deeply entrenched criminal empires are vulnerable to a persistent and principled rule of law. The confiscation of his beloved Piano della Scala estate, now repurposed for social good, stands as a permanent, physical monument to this victory. Michele Greco's biography is therefore not just one man's story. It is the story of a 30-year war between two opposing ideas of power, one based on fear and violence, the other on law and justice. In the end, it was not a clear-cut victory, for the mafia was not eradicated. But his story marks the moment the tide turned, the point at which the state, drenched in the blood of its best and brightest, finally found the will to fight back and prove that even a pope could be dethroned. His life and long imprisonment serve as a grim, enduring lesson on the corrosive nature of absolute power and the fragile, yet ultimately resilient, nature of the societies that must constantly fight to contain it. To truly understand the monumental significance of Michele Greco's downfall, one must look beyond the man himself and examine the intricate, devastating web of human tragedy that his commands orchestrated, a tapestry of stolen lives and broken families that forms the true, somber legacy of his reign, providing a stark, moral counterpoint to the clinical facts of trials and sentences. Each of the over 80 murders he was convicted of authorizing was not merely a statistic entered into a ledger of crime. It was a universe of love, memory, and potential violently and permanently extinguished. A seismic event that shattered the lives of all who knew the victim, sending ripples of grief and trauma through the social fabric of Sicily for generations. Consider the murder of General Carlo Alberto dalla Chiesa, a man who had heroically defeated the Red Brigades, and his young wife gunned down on a Palermo street in 1982. This was not just the killing of a senior state official, it was the orphaning of a family, the brutal snuffing out of a symbol of hope. A deliberate message that sent a chill through the entire nation and demonstrated the mafia's willingness to target the very heart of the state itself. Then there was Pio La Torre, the communist politician whose pioneering legislation became the very weapon later used to convict Greco. His assassination in the same year robbed Italy of a visionary political mind and a courageous voice for social justice. A man murdered for the crime of imagining a Sicily free from the mafia's grip. The list goes on, a horrifying roll call of judges, policemen, journalists, and rival mafiosi, each with their own story, their own dreams, their own family left to navigate the immense void of their absence. The sheer scale of the violence, sanctioned from the quiet of the Piano della Scala estate, is almost incomprehensible in its cold, bureaucratic efficiency. But perhaps the most profound and collective trauma was inflicted by the assassinations of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. These were not just murders, they were national wounds that continue to bleed in the Italian consciousness. Falcone, with his sharp legal mind and unwavering dedication, and Borsellino, with his profound humanity and emotional connection to the people of Sicily, represented the best of Italy, its intellect and its heart. Their deaths in the brutal, spectacular manner of the car bombs, were designed to terrorize, but they also created martyrs. The images of the massive craters on the highway and the residential street, the funerals attended by hundreds of thousands of silent, weeping citizens, the sight of Falcone's simple notes strewn desk and Borsellino's last, poignant family photograph. These became indelible icons of sacrifice. The lives of these two men and the countless other, less famous victims form the true human cost of Michele Greco's power. For every meeting he chaired, for every nod of approval he gave, a family somewhere in Sicily was condemned to a lifetime of unanswered questions and inconsolable grief. The mafia's strategy was always to spread a blanket of fear so thick it would smother all opposition, but beneath that blanket lay an ocean of individual sorrows. The wives who became widows, the children who grew up without fathers, the parents who had to bury their sons. These are the silent, enduring testimonies to the era of the Pope. When we speak of the Maxi trial and the life sentence of Michele Greco, it is crucial to remember that it was not just a legal victory. It was a long, delayed act of acknowledgement for these victims. It was the state, finally, putting into a formal legal record what the families had always known, that their loved ones were not collateral damage in a vague criminal war, but were intentionally targeted and murdered by a specific, structured organization led by a specific man. The conviction was a form of collective catharsis, an official declaration that these lives mattered, that their deaths were not in vain, and that someone, at the very top, was being held accountable. This is the profound and painful context that surrounds the clinical facts of Greco's imprisonment and death. His story is inextricably woven into the stories of those he had killed. His long years in a cell were a small, imperfect, but necessary counterbalance to the immense scale of the suffering he had authorized. His life sentence was a message to the victims' families that the state, however belatedly, had finally seen their pain and had acted to deliver a measure of justice, ensuring that the man who presided over this season of slaughter would never again walk in the sunlight as a free man. A small consolation, perhaps, but a vital one in the long, arduous journey toward healing a wounded land. Beyond the immediate human cost of the murders he sanctioned, the reign of Michele Greco and the Cosa Nostra he led inflicted a deep and lasting wound upon the very economic and social fabric of Sicily, a systemic corruption that distorted the island's development, impoverished its people, and created a culture of fear and dependency that would take generations to overcome. A legacy perhaps less dramatic than car bombs, but equally pernicious in its long-term effects. The mafia under Greco was not merely a criminal organization. It was a parasitic state that inserted itself into every conceivable economic transaction, creating a vast, informal tax on life itself. From the grandest public works project to the smallest farmer selling his lemons at market, a percentage, known as the pizzo, was demanded by the mafia. Failure to pay was not an option. It resulted in burned warehouses, vandalized equipment, or worse. This systemic extortion stifled entrepreneurship, scared away outside investment, and crippled legitimate businesses that could not compete with mafia, controlled companies who won public contracts through intimidation and bid rigging. The great building boom in Palermo during the 1960s and 70s, known as the Sack of Palermo, was a prime example, with Greco's organization pulling the strings from the shadows. Vast tracts of the city's historic and beautiful architecture were demolished and replaced with hastily built, often shoddy concrete apartment blocks. This was not urban development. It was a massive scheme for money laundering and profiteering, which destroyed the city's cultural heritage and created a bleak, modern urban landscape that served the interests of a few corrupt politicians and mafia-backed construction magnates. The control extended to essential resources like water. The Greco clan's historical grip on the irrigation canals of the conquered Oro region gave them life or death power over the agricultural sector, allowing them to decide which farms would thrive and which would wither. This economic stranglehold had a profound human cost. It created a climate where meritocracy was impossible, where success was determined not by talent or hard work, but by one's willingness to submit to the mafia's demands or one's connections to it. It fueled a massive brain drain as Sicily's best and brightest young people, seeing no future in a system so thoroughly corrupted, left for northern Italy or other countries, depriving the island of its most vital resource, its people's potential. Socially, the impact was even deeper. The mafia's culture of omerta, the code of silence, was not a romantic tradition, but a tool of social control that bred distrust and isolation. It taught people to look away, to not ask questions, to fear their neighbors and institutions alike. It eroded the very concept of community, replacing solidarity with suspicion. The state was viewed not as a protector, but as either absent, incompetent, or complicit, a perception that Greco's ability to operate with impunity for decades did much to reinforce. This created a vicious cycle. The mafia weakened the state, and the weakened state created a vacuum that the mafia filled, further eroding public trust. For the ordinary Sicilian, this meant living in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety, a need to constantly calculate the potential mafia implications of every action, from who you did business with to what you said in a cafe. This is the broader, more diffuse crime for which Michele Greco was equally responsible, a crime that could not be neatly listed in an indictment, but whose consequences were woven into the daily life of an entire population. The confiscation of his assets, particularly the Piano della Scala estate, was therefore a symbolic act of immense importance. It was the state not just punishing a man, but reclaiming a territory, both physical and psychological. It was a declaration that the resources of Sicily belonged to its people, not to a secret society of criminals. The fight against the mafia, which culminated in Greco's conviction, was thus not just a law enforcement operation. It was a necessary, foundational step toward rebuilding a civil society, toward restoring economic fairness, and toward giving the people of Sicily the chance to determine their own destiny, free from the shadow of the black hand that had gripped their island for so long, a shadow that was cast longest and darkest by the man who held court among the lemon groves of Sicily. A man whose legacy is measured not only in the lives he took but in the potential he stole from an entire generation. The psychological profile of Michele Greco presents a profound and unsettling paradox, a study in contrasts that challenges simplistic understandings of evil and reveals the banality that often lies at the heart of even the most monstrous power. To the outside world, and even to many within his inner circle, he was not a flamboyant, volatile gangster given to public displays of rage or cruelty. Instead, he cultivated the image of l'ingénieur, the engineer, a calm, deliberate, and sophisticated businessman, a devoted family man, and a patron of his local community. He was known for his old world manners, his soft spoken nature, and his love for the serene, agricultural life on his estate. He could discuss the nuances of citrus cultivation with genuine expertise and host elegant gatherings where talk of business and politics was conducted with refined decorum. This carefully constructed persona was his most effective weapon, a cloak of legitimacy that allowed him to operate in plain sight while the brutal machinery of his organization carried out its work. It enabled him to build bridges with corrupt elements of the political and financial elite who would have been wary of a more overtly thuggish figure. This duality forces us to confront a difficult truth. That great evil is not always accompanied by theatrical malevolence. It can reside in a man who appears perfectly ordinary, even respectable. The source of Greco's power was not a predisposition to violence in himself, but a chilling willingness to administer it dispassionately as a tool of business and governance. He was, in essence, the ultimate CEO of a corporation whose product was fear and whose business model was murder. The meetings at Piano della Scala were not drunken, chaotic gatherings of thugs. They were strategic board meetings where agendas were set, financial reports were heard, and operational decisions were made. A vote to eliminate a rival or a troublesome judge was, for Greco, likely no different from a board voting to terminate a failing product line, a cold, calculated decision made for the health and growth of the enterprise. This detachment, this ability to compartmentalize the horrific human consequences of his orders, is perhaps more terrifying than the impulsive violence of a street-level killer. It speaks to a worldview in which human life holds no intrinsic value, serving only as a variable in a grand equation of power and profit. He was a man who believed in the system he led, who saw Cosa Nostra not as a criminal conspiracy, but as a legitimate form of governance, a parallel state that provided order and resolution in a world he perceived as chaotic and unjust. This ideological conviction allowed him to rationalize the bloodshed as a necessary cost of doing business, of maintaining stability and discipline within his domain. The title, Al Papa, was not entirely ironic, like a pope. He saw himself as the ultimate arbiter of a rigid moral code, albeit a perverted one based on loyalty and betrayal. This psychological portrait does not excuse his actions in the slightest. Instead, it deepens their horror. It demonstrates that the capacity for overseeing mass murder can coexist with a love for one's family. an appreciation for natural beauty, and a desire for social standing. Michele Greco was not a monster from a fairy tale. He was a human being who made a series of conscious, calculated choices to pursue power through a system of institutionalized violence. His calm demeanor was not a mask hiding a frenzied killer, but the authentic face of a man for whom ordering a murder was simply another administrative task. This is the most enduring and frightening lesson of his life, that the line between civilized society and barbarism is not guarded by mythical beasts, but by the everyday choices of seemingly ordinary men who, from a position of insulated power, can sanction unimaginable cruelty without ever feeling the need to raise their voice or dirty their own hands, all while believing themselves to be, in their own distorted reality, gentlemen and pillars of their community. The global context in which Michele Greco operated and the international reverberations of his downfall cannot be overstated, for his story is not merely a Sicilian or Italian drama, but a pivotal chapter in the worldwide struggle against transnational organized crime, a narrative that stretched from the refining labs, hidden in the Sicilian hills, to the bustling streets of New York City and beyond. The era of Greco's ascendancy to the head of the cupola coincided perfectly with Cosa Nostra's metamorphosis from a regional criminal power into a global narcotics superpower, a transformation that was both the source of its unprecedented wealth and the catalyst for its eventual, concentrated confrontation with international law enforcement. The Pisa Connection case, investigated and prosecuted in the United States throughout the 1980s, was in many ways the transatlantic twin to the Maxi trial in Palermo, exposing the same network from the other side of the ocean. This intricate operation saw Sicilian mafiosi, many of them answering to the hierarchy Greco oversaw, using pizzerias and other small businesses as fronts to distribute vast quantities of heroin, funneling billions of dollars back to Sicily, where it fortified the power of bosses like Greco and financed the very murders of the magistrates who opposed them. This international dimension meant that the tentacles of Greco's organization reached into the heart of America, contributing to a devastating addiction epidemic in U.S. cities and creating a complex web of financial and criminal liaisons that connected the old world to the new. The cooperation between Italian magistrates like Giovanni Falcone and American prosecutors became a cornerstone of the fight against this new, borderless enemy. Falcone's legendary partnerships with officials in the FBI and DEA, sharing intelligence and strategies, broke new ground in international legal collaboration. This meant that the evidence gathered in New York could help convict bosses in Palermo, and the testimonies of pentiti in Sicily could lead to indictments in Brooklyn. The fall of Michele Greco, therefore, sent a powerful message to criminal networks worldwide that even when their operations spanned continents, the forces of law and order were learning to cooperate with a similar, if not greater, level of sophistication and determination. His conviction demonstrated that the head of the serpent could be struck, even if its body was wrapped around the globe. Furthermore, the legal innovations pioneered to combat his organization, such as the emphasis on following the money trail, the sophisticated use of protected witnesses, and the laws allowing for the seizure of criminal assets, became a blueprint for other nations grappling with their own powerful syndicates. The model of the Maxi trial inspired prosecutors in countries from Colombia to Japan, showing that it was possible to take on an entire criminal structure in a single, monumental proceeding, rather than picking off its members one by one. The story of Greco's rise and fall is thus a stark lesson in the globalized nature of modern crime, but also in the imperative of a globalized response. It showed that the corruption and violence festering in a seemingly isolated Sicilian community could have direct and deadly consequences thousands of miles away, and conversely, that the fight for justice in that same community required allies and resources from across the world. The imprisonment of the Pope of Cosa Nostra was a victory not just for Italy, but for every nation committed to the rule of law, a proof of concept that international cooperation could dismantle the most formidable of criminal empires. It marked the beginning of the end for the old, isolated models of organized crime and ushered in a new, more challenging era of interconnected criminal enterprises, but also a more interconnected and determined international legal network, a network that was forged, in large part, in the fiery crucible of the war against Michele Greco and the Sicilian Mafia he once commanded with absolute and ultimately fragile authority. The physical and symbolic transformation of Michele Greco's former stronghold, the Piano della Scala estate, stands as one of the most powerful and poetic acts of redemption in this entire saga, a tangible manifestation of the victory of civil society over the culture of death and intimidation that he represented. After its confiscation by the state, the estate did not lie fallow or decay as a ghostly monument to its dark past. Instead, it was reborn, repurposed with intentional symbolism to serve the very people its previous owner had terrorized and exploited. The vast lands, once the private hunting ground of a mafia boss and the clandestine meeting place where murders were sanctioned, were transferred to the cooperative movement. Specifically, it was given to a consortium named Lavoro e non solo, so work and not only, an organization dedicated to creating legitimate employment and promoting the values of legality, especially among the youth of Sicily, who for generations had seen the mafia as one of the few viable paths to power and prosperity. The fortified walls that once shielded Greco from justice now enclosed thriving agricultural projects. The rooms where the cupola plotted the deaths of judges and policemen now host educational workshops where schoolchildren learn about the dangers of organized crime and the importance of the rule of law. The land itself, which once symbolized the mafia's feudal control over the island's resources, now produces organic citrus fruits and olives. Its harvests sold under brand names that proudly proclaim their origin from confiscated mafia assets. This is not merely a change of ownership, it is a profound exorcism. It is the state and the courageous civil society organizations that partnered with it, actively reclaiming territory both geographical and psychological. Every tomato grown, every child educated, every job created on that soil is a direct repudiation of Greco's legacy. It is a living, breathing argument against the nihilism and greed he embodied. The estate's transformation sends an unmistakable message that the land belongs to the people, not to the mafia. That work should be dignified and legal, not exploitative and criminal, and that the future of Sicily lies in cooperation and transparency, not in omerta and violence. This act of creative restitution has become a model for similar initiatives across Italy, where thousands of properties, companies, and plots of land seized from the mafia are being turned into farms, hotels, social centers, and small businesses. They serve as daily, visible reminders that the state did not just imprison mafiosi. It took back what they had stolen and is using it to build a better, healthier society. For the victims' families, the sight of children playing on land that was once the command center of their loved ones' murderers is a form of profound, if bittersweet, justice. It ensures that the memory of the victims is honored not with monuments of stone, but with living, productive projects that embody the values for which they fought and died. The story of Piano della Scala, therefore, is the final, elegant inversion of the Greco narrative. In life, he used the appearance of legitimate agrarian power to mask a core of absolute criminality. In its aftermath, the state has used his very seat of power to generate legitimate social good, stripping away the facade and replacing the criminal core with a purpose of pure, productive legality. It is the ultimate defeat for a man like Greco, whose identity was so tied to his land and his control over it. His kingdom was not only taken from him, it was reprogrammed to actively work against everything he stood for. The echo of this transformation is far more powerful than the echo of any gunshot or bomb blast that once originated from that place. It is the quiet, persistent sound of healing, a sound that speaks of a future where the name Michele Greco will be remembered not with fear, but as a cautionary tale of a defeated power whose throne was ultimately converted into a garden for a new generation, a generation that we must hope will choose a different path, a path illuminated not by the darkness of the Black Hand, but by the light of the law and the simple, enduring dignity of honest work. The enduring cultural and historical impact of Michele Greco's life and the entire era of the Maxi trial has woven itself deeply into the fabric of Italian and global consciousness, transforming from a series of criminal events into a powerful, cautionary narrative that continues to inform art, literature, public policy, and the very identity of modern Sicily. The story of the mafia wars, the heroic magistrates, and the fallen bosses like Greco has provided a rich, if dark, wellspring of material for filmmakers, novelists, and playwrights who have sought to understand and explain the complex psychological and social forces at play. These are not mere crime thrillers. They are profound moral explorations of the nature of power, the cost of justice, and the fragile line between civilization and barbarism. The acclaimed films and television series that depict this period, while dramatized, serve a vital function. They keep the memory of this struggle alive for new generations who did not live through the terror of the car bombs and the funeral processions. They translate the complex legal and historical facts into human stories of courage, betrayal, and sacrifice, ensuring that figures like Falcone and Borsellino are not just names in a history book, but enduring symbols of resistance. Furthermore, the very methodology of fighting organized crime was revolutionized by this period. The Italian state's hard-won lessons, the effectiveness of the pentiti system, the necessity of asset confiscation, the importance of international cooperation, and the need for a cultural fight alongside a legal one have become part of a global playbook. Police forces and prosecutors from around the world study the Maxi trial and the strategies of Falcone as a masterclass in dismantling complex criminal networks. In Italy itself, the memory of this era is institutionalized. The Giornata della Memoria e dell'Impegno in Ricordo del Vittime del Mafia, the Day of Memory and Commitment in remembrance of the victims of the mafias, is held annually on March 21, where the names of all known mafia victims are read aloud in public squares across the country, a solemn ritual that refuses to let the dead be forgotten and reaffirms society's commitment to the fight. Schools throughout Sicily have educational programs dedicated to the culture of legality, teaching children from a young age about the perils of organized crime and the heroes who stood against it. This cultural and educational work is perhaps the most potent long-term weapon against the mafia, more powerful than any single life sentence. It attacks the root of the problem, the social acceptance, and the warped sense of respect that allowed men like Greco to flourish. The story of Michele Greco is now taught not as a story of power, but as a story of failure. He is not glorified. He is studied as the architect of his own demise, a man whose overreach provoked a backlash that crippled his organization for a generation. His legacy, therefore, is a deeply paradoxical one. In life, he sought to build an immortal empire of silence and fear. In death, he has become the subject of endless discussion, analysis, and public condemnation. The silence he demanded, omerta, has been shattered by 1,000 voices in classrooms, in cinemas, in books, and in public squares. The fear he instilled has been, in large part, replaced by a collective commitment to remember and to resist. The most fitting epitaph for Michele Greco is not written on his tombstone in Sicily, but is instead etched into the ongoing, living memory of a society that used his catastrophic failure as a foundational lesson in the perpetual defense of democracy. His life serves as a permanent reminder of the price of liberty and the unending vigilance required to protect it. A dark star in Sicily's firmament, whose very darkness helps to define the brilliance of the light that ultimately, and at great cost, managed to pierce through it, ensuring that his reign is remembered not with awe, but as a terrible warning from history, a warning that continues to resonate with urgent relevance in every corner of the world where the forces of law and order must contend with the seductive, destructive allure of absolute criminal power. To comprehend the full measure of the societal transformation that followed the downfall of Michele Greco. One must turn from the halls of power and the courtrooms to the streets of Palermo and the towns of Sicily, where a quiet but revolutionary movement was taking root, a grassroots awakening of ordinary citizens who, emboldened by the sacrifices of the magistrates and the definitive sentences of the Maxi trial, began to reclaim their cities from the culture of silence and complicity. This was not a movement led by the state, but by the people themselves, a flowering of civil courage that proved to be as crucial to the fight as any legal decree. The most powerful symbol of this awakening was the birth and explosive growth of the Addio Pizzo, Goodbye Pizzo movement. It began in 2004 when a group of young Sicilians, students and young professionals, tired of living in a system where the mafia's pizzo, or protection money, was accepted, if resented, fact of business life, began plastering Palermo with stickers that bore a simple, revolutionary message: "Non intero popolo ci paga il pizzo e un popolo senza dignità." An entire people that pays the pizzo is a people without dignity. This was a direct challenge to the economic engine of Cosa Nostra, an appeal to the conscience of both business owners and consumers. The movement grew, creating a network of businesses that publicly pledged not to pay the pizzo, and of consumers who committed to patronizing only those establishments. This was a profoundly risky act of defiance. To openly refuse the mafia was to invite retaliation, potentially violent, but the context had changed. The heroic examples of Falcone and Borsellino had created a new moral climate, and the state's visible presence and more robust anti-racket laws provided a fragile but real sense of protection. The Addio Pizzo movement demonstrated that the mafia's power was not just sustained by fear, but by a perceived social consensus, and that this consensus could be broken. It gave business owners a collective voice and a collective shield, transforming them from isolated, vulnerable targets into a united front. This was a direct attack on the legacy of Michele Greco, whose wealth and power were built on this very system of systematic extortion. Beyond Addio Pizzo, other civic groups flourished. Organizations like Libera, founded by priest Luigi Ciotti, mobilized thousands of people, especially the young, to manage and work on the lands confiscated from mafiosi, turning symbols of criminal power into beacons of social hope. These were not just economic projects. They were pilgrimages of principle, where people from all over Italy could come to Sicily and literally work the land to heal it. The very language used in society began to shift. The romanticized Hollywood image of the mafioso as a charming man of honor was increasingly replaced by the public perception of him as a parasitic criminal, a uomo di disonore, a man of dishonor who impoverished his own community. This cultural shift was perhaps the most significant defeat for the old world mafia of Michele Greco. Their cherished respect was being publicly stripped away, replaced with contempt and social ostracization. While the mafia certainly still exists, and while pockets of deep-seated corruption and fear remain, the Sicily of today is fundamentally different from the island Greco ruled. The change is palpable. There is a newfound pride in legality, a growing refusal to be complicit. The story of Michele Greco, therefore, does not end with his death in a prison cell. It finds its true conclusion in the daily choices of Sicilian shopkeepers who refuse to pay the pizzo, in the school teachers who educate their students about the martyrs of the anti-mafia, in the young people who choose to build their futures on the very lands that were once the spoils of a criminal war. His downfall created a space, paid for with blood, in which this new civil society could grow. It proved that while laws can imprison individuals, it is the courage of ordinary people that ultimately defeats an idea. The legacy of the man known as the Pope is thus defined not only by the empire he built, but by the resilient human garden that has grown in the ruins of that empire, a garden that he could never have imagined, and whose existence is the most powerful and enduring repudiation of his life's work, a silent, persistent testament to the fact that even the most deeply entrenched darkness cannot, forever, extinguish the light of a collective will yearning to be free. The philosophical and moral questions raised by the life and legacy of Michele Greco force us to confront the very nature of evil within human societies, challenging us to move beyond simplistic explanations of insanity or pure greed, and to examine the terrifyingly mundane and systemic ways in which great harm can be administered. Greco was not a psychopath in the clinical sense. He was a rational actor within a specific, perverted cultural and economic system. A man who understood the consequences of his actions and pursued them with clear, calculated intent because they served his goals of power, wealth, and the preservation of a world order he believed in. This presents a far more disturbing reality than the notion of a lone, deranged killer. It suggests that evil can be bureaucratized, that it can be embedded within the normal functioning of a society, administered by individuals who see themselves not as villains, but as pragmatists, leaders, and even patriarchs. The story of Greco compels us to ask, is the greater danger the chaotic, individual criminal, or the cold, efficient, and systematic criminality of a structured organization led by seemingly ordinary men? His ability to compartmentalize his life, the loving family man in one moment, the ruthless CEO of a murder corporation in the next, reveals a chilling human capacity for moral disengagement. This is the same psychological mechanism that has enabled atrocities throughout history, from totalitarian regimes to corporate scandals that ruin millions of lives. It is the ability to see human beings not as feeling, thinking individuals, but as obstacles, liabilities, or mere units in a strategic equation. Greco's mafia was a microcosm of this phenomenon, a small-scale model of how power, when left unchecked by ethics and the rule of law, inevitably corrupts and dehumanizes. His relationship with the concept of honor is another profound paradox. He lived by a strict code of omerta and respect, a code that demanded loyalty and silence. Yet his entire empire was built on the ultimate betrayal of the wider social contract, on the exploitation and murder of the very community he claimed to be a part of. This twisted, inward-facing morality, which values loyalty to the organization above all else, even above the fundamental precept of "thou shalt not kill," is a hallmark of destructive cults and criminal syndicates alike. It creates a closed universe with its own logic, where good and evil are redefined to serve the interests of the powerful. The fall of Greco, therefore, is not just the fall of a man, but the exposure of this fraudulent morality. The trials, the pentiti, the convictions all served to drag this hidden, perverted value system into the bright light of public scrutiny and universal human ethics, where it was rightly condemned. His life forces us to reflect on the nature of justice itself. Was his life imprisonment in a solitary cell a slow, silent erosion of his being, a fitting punishment for a man who orchestrated sudden, violent ends for so many? Can any prison sentence truly balance the scales for 80 murders? The Italian state's answer was that it was not about revenge, but about accountability and prevention. His sentence was a statement that such a concentration of criminal power would not be tolerated, that there is a line in the sand beyond which society will not be bullied. In a deeper sense, the most profound justice may lie not in his punishment, but in the positive outcomes that emerged from his defeat. The strengthened rule of law, the empowered civil society, the repurposed assets, the enduring memory of the victims. In this light, Michele Greco's story becomes a universal cautionary tale about the seduction of power and the absolute necessity of robust, independent institutions to check that power. It is a reminder that the fight against such forces is not merely a military or legal battle, but an ongoing philosophical and ethical one, a constant struggle to define and defend the values that hold a civilization together against the relentless pressure of those who believe that might makes right and that the world belongs to those ruthless enough to seize it. His legacy, therefore, is a question posed to each generation. What are you willing to do to protect your society from its own Michele Grecos? The answer to that question will forever determine whether the light of justice can continue to hold the darkness at bay. As we approach the final summation of this epic narrative, it is essential to trace the unbroken, though often fragile, thread of legacy that connects the era of Michele Greco directly to the Sicily and Italy of today, examining how the seismic events of his rise and fall have fundamentally reshaped the nation's political landscape, its judicial system, and its ongoing daily struggle against the enduring, albeit mutated, presence of organized crime. The most immediate and tangible legacy was the institutional hardening of the Italian state. The laws that were passed in the white, hot fury, and resolve following the murders of Falcone and Borsellino, such as the formalization of the pentito system, the strengthening of 41 bis, and the powerful asset confiscation tools, became permanent fixtures of the legal arsenal. The anti-mafia pool of magistrates in Palermo, though forever marked by tragedy, was institutionalized, ensuring that the specialized, collaborative model of investigation would continue. This was not a temporary war. It was a permanent restructuring of the state's defenses. Politically, the relationship between the mafia and power was irrevocably altered. The cozy, often deniable, connections between certain political factions and Cosa Nostra were exposed to public scrutiny, leading to a slow, painful, but necessary cleansing of the political class. The mafia's strategy of directly influencing the state through violence and intimidation, so brazenly employed during Greco's peak, was largely abandoned as counterproductive. It had provoked a response that nearly destroyed them. Instead, Cosa Nostra and its counterparts like the Ndrangheta adapted, becoming quieter, more financially sophisticated, and focusing on infiltrating the legitimate economy and public procurement through corruption rather than overt terror. This presents the modern challenge. The enemy is less visible, but in some ways more deeply embedded. The fight is no longer against car bombs, but against complex money laundering schemes and white-collar collusion. Yet, the tools to fight this new war were forged in the fire of the war against Greco. The financial police, the DNA's Direzione Nazionale Antimafia, and the international cooperation networks all stand as living legacies of that period. On a societal level, the most profound change is the existence of a vocal, organized, and unwavering anti-mafia culture. The memory of the victims is not a fading relic, but an active civic religion. The names of Falcone and Borsellino are invoked not in sorrow, but as a source of strength and a standard to which public servants are held. Every time a business joins the Addiopiso list, every time a teacher explains the meaning of the Capassi bombing to a classroom of children, every time a confiscated asset is put to social use, the legacy of that era is reaffirmed. It has created a societal immune system that did not exist before. This does not mean the mafia is gone. It means the ground is far less fertile for it to operate with the same impunity it enjoyed under Greco. The organization today is a different beast, more global, more financially focused, and perhaps in the long term, more dangerous in its insidious, silent corruption. But it no longer holds the same psychological stranglehold on the Sicilian people. The myth of its invincibility was shattered in the Olla bunker, and the myth of its honor was buried with the victims of its terror. Michele Greco's life, therefore, serves as a historical benchmark, a before and after marker. He represents the pinnacle of the old mafia, the one that believed it could rule by fear alone. His defeat marked the beginning of its necessary evolution into a less brazen, but more diffuse entity. The story of his downfall is a permanent part of Italy's national narrative, a story told to remind citizens of the price of liberty and the constant need for vigilance. It is a story that proves that even the most deeply entrenched criminal powers can be confronted and crippled when the state finds the will and the people find the courage. The long shadow he cast is now perpetually pierced by the lights of memory, justice, and a refusal to forget, ensuring that the Sicily he sought to control is now a land that understands, better than most, the true cost of both tyranny and freedom, and remains locked in a complex, unending dance between its dark past and its hard-won, cautiously hopeful present, a present that would not have been possible without the collective, painful, and ultimately triumphant journey through the reign and ruin of the man they called the Pope And so we arrive at the end of our journey, a journey that began in the perfumed groves of Sicily and concludes in the silent, sterile confines of a prison infirmary, a journey through the life of a man who sought to become a king and died a prisoner, a narrative that stretches across the vast and turbulent landscape of 20th century Sicily, touching upon the darkest depths of human cruelty and the most luminous heights of human courage. The story of Michele Greco is now complete, not as a legend to be admired, but as a complex historical tapestry to be studied, understood, and remembered as a stark warning for all time. From his birth into a family already steeped in power, to his patient, calculated rise through the ranks of Cosa Nostra, from his coronation as the Pope in the rustic opulence of Piano della Scala, to his cold, blooded sanctioning of a reign of terror that claimed scores of lives, including the best and brightest of a nation, from the unprecedented audacity of the maxi trial that named his crimes before the world, to the shattering vengeance of the Capaci and Viad Amelio bombings that sought to undo its victory from the final, unyielding confirmation of his life sentence to his long, isolated decline and eventual death behind bars. Every thread of this story has been woven into a single, sobering picture. It is the picture of absolute power achieved and absolute power lost, a demonstration of the immutable law that no empire built on fear and blood can truly endure. The legacy of Michele Greco is not the legacy he would have wanted. He sought to build an eternal dynasty of silence and submission. Instead, he provoked a thunderous, unending chorus of defiance. He sought to be remembered as a man of respect. He is remembered as a man of dishonor. He sought to rule Sicily from the shadows. His most prized possession now serves as a beacon of light and legal redemption. His life ultimately proves that the pursuit of power through violence is a self-defeating prophecy, for it inevitably forges the very weapons of its own destruction. In this case, the hardened resolve of magistrates like Falcone and Borsellino, the collective conscience of a people movements like Addio Pizzo, and the relentless machinery of a state finally shamed into action. His story is a testament to the fact that while evil can gather immense strength, and while it can inflict wounds that never fully heal, it cannot ultimately triumph over the collective, patient, and courageous will of those who refuse to be broken. The memory of his victims, from the highest judge to the most anonymous citizen, now stands as a permanent guardian of democracy, a reminder of the price that was paid for the relative peace and legality enjoyed today. As this narrative closes, let it not be with a sense of an ending, but with a sense of vigilance. The world still has its Michele Grecos, in different forms and different places. The seduction of easy power, the corruption of institutions, and the exploitation of the vulnerable are eternal challenges. The story you have just heard is not a relic of the past. It is a mirror held up to the present, asking us what we are willing to tolerate, what we are willing to fight for, and what kind of legacy we ourselves wish to leave behind. The battle between light and darkness is never truly won. It is only ever ongoing. And it is a battle that requires not just heroes, but an entire society committed to the dull, daily, unglamorous work of upholding justice, speaking truth, and cherishing freedom. If this deep dive into the heart of one of history's most formidable criminal empires has held your attention, if you believe in the importance of remembering these stories to safeguard our future, then your role in this ongoing story is crucial. Show your support for content that delves beyond the headlines and explores the profound forces that shape our world. Smash that like button to let us know you want more journeys into true history's most compelling chapters. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next exploration into the shadows, and hit the notification bell to be the first to know when we upload. Most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. What lesson from the rise and fall of Michele Greco resonates most deeply with you? Your engagement ensures that these vital stories continue to be told, remembered, and learned from. Thank you for listening.